And we're back. This is the Colombia Calling podcast. I'm your host, Richard McColl. My very special guest this week is none other than David Restrepo. He's the Director of Investigation at the CESED Los Andes. He works, well, I'm going to let him say what he works on, but really he's working on illicit economies and how to sort of establish rural development, how to work alongside indigenous communities. And I guess sort of destigmatize the hoja de coca, or the coca leaf. Of course, coca being the plant that produces, well, went all the way down the line, and it's bastardized in its way all the way down the line in the process to cocaine. But he's the expert. David, thank you so much for coming on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here.
And no, honestly, it's we've had back and forth on WhatsApp and Twitter and so on, but I first became aware of your work by Twitter, and then I looked up some of your articles, and you really do have an immensely profound background in the evaluation and innovation for drug policy. And we're here in Colombia, of course. It is a consumer country, but it is mainly, I would say, a producing country. How did you...
That's what we are famous for.
Yeah, unfortunately so. But how did you get into this? Because I know you're from southwestern Colombia in Cali, which is kind of a front line in this. But I mean, it's a strategic city. You think of that straight line from the coca growing areas, Cali, straight north, Medellin, straight again, up to the Bahia de Urabá. It's strategic out to the Pacific coast. So I'm guessing you grew up with, how do I say this? It was a very present issue.
Absolutely. And I think that has, for most people working in drug policy, been a main driver for our involvement in the issue, is a past and a frustration with especially for Colombians and of course other Latin Americans, a frustration that our countries are being ravaged by an issue that serves no one right now. And only very small private interests. And yet has become so entrenched, and the misunderstanding around psychoactive plants and the drugs obtained from them is so profound that shifting that political economy has been a very large endeavor. And so, yes, I grew up when Cali was, and remains sadly today, the hub of the war in this country and of violence, and all of the different forms of the conflict were kind of overlaid on each other. There was the conflict between the guerrillas and paramilitaries, between the different versions of the drug cartels, and then just the general gang violence, kidnapping. Going to school was sometimes like an action movie. You kind of know the drill if you remember what Colombia was like in that time period, and Cali in particular suffered probably the most of all the big cities. So I grew up in the middle of that. In my family, there was also close relatives, my father in particular, who suffered from substance use disorders, and so I also got to see the whole ecosystem of the drug issue. In university, I studied the topic. I studied Coca in particular, and Coca policies in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, and found out very early on how Colombia had the most gung-ho, the most aggressive approach towards dealing with this plant, and yet the worst results in terms of violence, in terms also of drug use. Colombia has a higher rate of drug use than our neighbors. Yeah. And so clearly the prohibitionist and punitive approach is not working for us. When from afar, because I was living abroad in London in particular, there was this big shift happening in cannabis, especially Uruguay, and also before that, Colorado and Washington State in the U.S. I felt that the time had come for me to return to what had been, a personal and academic passion, and become more involved on the activist front. And I thought, I am an economist in political sciences and have a long career in terms of strategy consulting and helping develop businesses. I thought that the route forward was to help develop a legal industry just like cannabis had. And for a number of years, I pursued that agenda, but I hadn't really understood the very profound cultural and even spiritual components of Coca and what it means. And it has been more recently in my return to Colombia in the past 6 years that I developed an understanding of that through journeys both in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. And I realized that actually the struggle for Coca is very much aligned with the struggle of indigenous people in this continent to not just preserve their cultural roots, but to promote a much more nature-centric way of organizing society. And so my more recent work has been focusing on how do we build intercultural alliances to contribute to that cause.
Wow. This is a huge field. I mean, a huge field that we're looking at, and we need to think of how to broach this as a subject here on the podcast. This is an excellent introduction, but at the same time, I'm sort of thinking, well, we need to talk about, I guess, colonization and then the use of the coca leaf, because of course, prior to the arrival of the Europeans, the coca leaf was its sacred use. When did it become something so nefarious for for the world? Where does this prohibition come in, and does it start?
So I think there are two. There are at least two big moments. You want to be very simplistic with the history of Coca, but there was a first moment of the European invasion, the Spaniards arriving here and not really understanding why people were putting these leaves in their mouths. And the earliest report of Coca is by Amerigo Vespucci, being completely bemused by and racist about indigenous people chewing coca leaves and not understanding. And the Spanish crown in the early days tried to eradicate coca because it was aligned with indigenous spirituality, and there was a desire for everybody to be a Catholic at that point, and so that conflicted with the Spanish agenda. But they had to settle. They had to kind of let it be, because without coca, the mining economy of these colonies wasn't functional. The high elevation mines of Peru and Bolivia needed coca to work, to be as productive as they were. Potosi in particular needed, I can't remember the figures, but gargantuan amounts of coca leaf for that mining economy to work. So for a long time, in the colonial establishment, coca was okay as long as it was relegated to the subservient class of indigenous people. And the persecution for it ended because of that kind of that mode where the people who were white or pretending to be white or aspiring to be white would put coca aside and leave coca for the underclass. Then in the 19th century, there was this renewed interest in botany and in plants and their chemical constituents, and that's when morphine and heroin and cocaine were isolated. And at first, cocaine was this miracle drug, and coca leaf considered this elixir and this wonderful thing, and the first mass consumption good that was traded internationally and had a lot of adverts around it was this thing called Van Mariani. And I highly recommend reading this book by a scholar in the United States, Paul Gutenberg, called Andean Cocaine. It gives a great summary of what happened around coca and cocaine in that time. So for a number of years, there was a boom of legal coca and cocaine. But then the United States in particular had this thing called, I forget the exact term right now in English, but there was a big backlash against the use of alcohol and any form of intoxicant. It's called the temperance movement.
Okay.
And the temperance movement became a very powerful political force that aligned with a number of other political movements, though some of them positive, like the suffragettes. Some of them less aligned with my values, like anti-immigration and so on. And that led to prohibition in the early 20th century in the US. And the prohibition, of course, backfired royally in the US for a decade. And when the movement to end prohibition, which was also led by women, by the way, succeeded, what was forgotten was all these other plants and drugs. And the first drug czar, Harry Anslinger, I don't know if you've heard of this guy, he wanted to repurpose the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and decided to go after these plants and after coca and after cocaine, after cannabis, and over a number of decades managed to create the platform for what is currently the DEA, as well as the international drug control system. And that was a very useful geopolitical tool by the US in terms of dealing with its southern neighbors, in particular Peru, which had the main coca and cocaine industry, legal coca and cocaine industry at that stage. And through a fairly complicated, I don't think there's time for going into all the details, fairly complicated array of moves that led to the prohibition of coca and cocaine in Peru and Bolivia, and this industry going underground and stewing and then re-emerging and becoming a major force in the late 60s and 70s. And Colombia's very outstanding role as a site of contraband and under the table dealings primed us for being a protagonist in the illicit drug trade ever since.
So could we say, I mean, when we look back at when you were looking back at Elsinger is his name?
Yes, Harry Anslinger.
Anslinger, sorry. No, was his policy was, okay, we'll outlaw this, and then it was, I imagine it was hanging a threat of all sorts of conditions over countries such as Peru, Colombia, and Bolivia. Was it were there all sorts of embargoes taking place? What was the point?
I think it wasn't as clean cut as that. In fact, there have been in the three countries, especially in Peru and Colombia, a faction of public health experts who think that the way forward with dealing with psychoactive and intoxicating substances is through prohibition. So I think what the US was very competent in doing was to divide and conquer and to side with that faction to drive its agenda forward. So there's of course some external coercion and threat used, but there's also internal allies in Latin America that align with those U.S. interests, and those are the ones who end up having kind of the most power and the most influence in when you look at the history of prohibition and punitive drug policy in the Americas.
I mean, we're here. You're Colombian. You live this up close and personally, and have seen the destruction with your own eyes. My, albeit brief in the grand scheme of things, time here has permitted me to see as well. Some of it. I've gone out to areas where coca is cultivated, in Peru as well, in Bolivia, of course, it's very prevalent. I mean, it was the Yungas areas.
Yungas, yes.
Yeah, So I've been all over these places.
Tropical
Yeah, and seen all these things and talked to people. Friends of mine are out there reporting in Catatumbo here in Norte Santander. And, you know, the prohibition is clearly not working. I mean, that's the absolute tragedy recently of the soldiers being killed by the ELN up there. So the guerrilla group, the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, and all these things just show, you know, this illegal economy is too profitable, too economically viable to be kept underground now, because it you know, Colombia, we're looking at more than 60 years of tearing the country apart over this, and, you know, from the top down, bottom up, and so on. So your work is you are out there looking at ways to, I would say, engender rural development through legal uses of these psychoactive substances. I mean, that means that you're out there on the ground looking at people who are maybe more entrepreneurial and perhaps advising.
Yes, so I think one of the main allies in this endeavor is Coca, who were the first indigenous company to sell coca leaf products, and who have pioneered the construction of that legal market through their work as a business, and also through their litigation. And they established the legal, the window of legality under which coca leaf operates in this country, and which is now has a very strong judicial precedent going all the way to the Constitutional Court to enable that to continue. So yes, my work involves a rural element. It also involves an urban element. And in particular, what I am focused on is how do we build a supply system that fosters good public health outcomes. So I think it is essential for us to understand that all of these, psychoactive plants and their derivatives need to be treated with a lot of respect and for certain end goals. And to build the social norms that foster moderation, that foster the beneficial uses of these plants. And of course, given how entrenched the system is, beginning with the lowest hanging fruit and with those elements that are most likely to have an impact. And I believe coca leaf, which is a very benign plant, which is not associated with substance use disorders, and which has a number of underexploited nutritional, medicinal, and agroecological applications, is one of the key efforts, alongside cannabis, of course. But cannabis has a lot more traction all over the world, and coca leaf needs attention from Colombian society even more so, I believe.
So when you talk about this Coca, I mean, they obviously had or were able to find the legal manners in which to open the I wouldn't say a loophole, but open the constitutional right to produce these things. This obviously this remains open, but I imagine it's tricky to continue along these grounds. I mean, I imagine the legalities are very, very intricate.
The issues aren't anymore on the legal, but on the regulatory side. Of course, that's kind of a specious distinction. But the issue in Colombia is that our Food and Drug Regulator, INVIMA, does not recognize that indigenous product registries are legitimate for selling coca across the country. And so there has been a very prolonged dispute, and there are controversies around jurisdiction because two of the courts of the high courts of Colombia have sided with Coca, but INVIMA does not recognize the court sentences that back the Coca argument. So Coca has a lot of problems in terms of its route to market because other government authorities, in particular those related to INVIMA, as well as the health secretariats of the municipalities, continue to confiscate their product and impede this very important idea from gaining full fruition.
Yeah. But INVIMA is a particularly difficult entity. I mean, just from a completely anecdotal circumstance, I had people I know importing cider from England, and the difficulty they had through INVIMA. And so I can only think, cider that has been obviously processed and is fine and, whatever else. I can only imagine Coca. It's what they deal with. It's like, so, I mean, you're talking about this, as you said, the regulatory element. Is that the solution? A legal regulation of coca leaf and coca products? Is that what we should be aiming for?
If done properly, yes. But regulations can be done very improperly, and our experience with cannabis is a great illustration of that. A lot of good intentions in terms of building a legal cannabis market that could help reduce violence in some, in the southwest of Colombia in particular. Cauca has the biggest cannabis fields in the world. And that illicit trade is currently used to finance armed groups that continue disputing the territory there and continue terrorizing the population. Unfortunately, the way the regulations were made have fostered a model that really doesn't serve anybody. And it tried to create essentially a corporate pharmaceutical style market, which was not going to help the populations that most need to participate in that market. But it's not even serving them, because the barriers to entry are so high, and the whole scheme is so Byzantine that it is very hard to sell cannabis products in Colombia, and that market is very much at the end of the rope, and a lot of companies have been shuttering, and yes, regulation is the way forward, but we need a sensible form of regulation that is inclusive of the existing supply systems, rather than trying to impose new and not tested supply systems on the world. And the regulations in Colombia in particular need to really have a big challenge, because Colombia is the world's illicit drug supplier for cocaine, also for cannabis. In fact, we export loads of cannabis to the rest of Latin America and beyond, and of other substances too. And that means that drugs are very cheap here, and they can be produced in very many places. And so trying to create many controls is likely going to generate it's going to make it very difficult for the legal market to compete with the illegal one. So I think that's the challenge that the Colombian government and both branches of government are having to contend with, and that people interested in this subject, like myself, other academics, people in the NGO sector, the social movements, are trying to grapple with. How do we do this? And how do we do this amidst an ongoing war that isn't at the scale that it used to be, but that remains very, very strong in some parts of the country, and where the actors, have become so fragmented, we don't know who's who and who is, in control of what area. So doing that in Colombia's current context is a particular challenge. But I remain, of the opinion that we need to tackle it, because Colombia's peace really depends on it. Colombia's peace, environmental survival, the survival of especially indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities depends on us figuring this out.
That's what I think. You touch on you just said the Afro-Colombian communities, the indigenous communities, so the traditional communities who inhabit these very fractured regions. As you mentioned, we don't know who really is running each region. There's so many splinter groups. We've had a little bit more light shone on who might be who and where and so on in this desire for paz total or total peace, because there's 30 something different groups who have supposedly signed up for this policy, the cornerstone policy of the current government. And this brings me a little bit into the politics, because I know that you returned to Colombia in 2016, of course, being the year that the peace accord was, well, I mean, voted against and then pushed through Congress and passed, and it's written into the Constitution. And of course, one of the points on the peace accord, a main point, was that how to deal with illicit drugs. And, you know, one of the, again, the key points within that was, you know, the total prohibition of the use of glyphosate in the eradication, and things looked to be moving, you know, in a positive direction. When we think of that, it's being discussed. Juan Manuel Santos, the then president, you know, had nothing to lose, and he has nothing to lose now, talks about the need for a legalization. But of course, from a position of being now an elder statesman in international politics, you know, again, it's nothing to lose. And then you get a guy who comes in, President Duque, who tries to bring back glyphosate. Unfortunately, in my opinion, failed. And the whole issue of coca cultivation, albeit for, you know, traditional and medicinal and sacred purposes, was all lumped under the, again, which is what this is my interpretation, under the issue. This is now Ministry of Defense. This is now an issue. We have to destroy everything. If I'm wrong, jump in, please. And now we've got Gustavo Petro, you know, our first leftist president, who stood up in front of the United Nations and gave a very strong speech, his, you know, inaugural speech there about the, you know, the use of coca for its other properties, and of course, you know, the consumer market in North America and so on, without saying North America, but everybody knew it. Are we in a government? Are we experiencing a government now who is putting policy into place to allow your type of research to come into fruition and your type of work, or was it a lot of talk?
Oof, I mean, that's a very polemical question. I would say that the ambitions that the Petro administration had in the days prior to actually, you know, when he was president-elect and not in office, had to be toned down because the United States got very upset with the idea and signaled that was a red line. That said, there have been positive movements in terms of more progressive drug policy. I don't think we can take that for granted yet, and it's still early days. I think it would be naive to reverse the course of over 50 years. You know, really, prohibition is over 100 years old. To reverse that in Colombia in the first year of an administration.
Oh yeah.
And I think that what the Petro administration has been trying to do is kind of manage the fallout of the US getting very angry at progressive talk.
Yeah.
I think that there's efforts in terms of changing course with the crop substitution program, changing its logic, involving communities a lot more, and trying to get the different state agencies to become organized. At the same time, this government has had a very unwieldy agenda, and its ability to execute it has suffered as a result of that too. I think higher expectations and the ability to actually fulfill them. And drug policy, unfortunately, is a very convenient, a very convenient policy tool for the defense establishment and for right-wing discourse. It is likely one of the things that suffers the most when big negotiations happen between political factions here. So from the beginning, I assumed that the talk would be tempered by reality, but I have not lost hope that we're able to move forward on a number of fronts. So cannabis reform is likely to succeed in a short period of time. I think with Coca leaf, there's already a lot more that we could do under the current legal frameworks. And I think the indigenous movement is becoming very well aware of the opportunity that it has now to change the basics of the regulatory model. And I think that because the administration remains favorable to those kinds of changes and have made very clear statements on along those lines, I think something is likely to happen with Coca leaf. There's a lot happening in terms of the public health approaches to dealing with drug addiction that are also going to help. So I think we will make some strides. Will we change the status quo around cocaine in this 4 years? Maybe not, but hopefully we will, as a country, create a number of important institutional assets to enable further work down the line.
I think, I mean, one thing you said there with these sort of expectations and the ability to fulfill them, that could be a phrase used for most of the fundamental changes that this government wants to do. A lot of promises that on the outlook look fantastic, but we have seen Gustavo Petro in power as mayor of Bogota. For those who don't know, I actually worked in his mayor's office for 12 days.
Oh.
It was my second to last formal job and my second shortest job, I think, or my shortest job. I can't remember which one. I'm not so good at formal work. But at the same time, that said, yes, I think there will be a concerted effort under this administration to make progress. It won't be the progress that they promised, as you said, when he was president-elect, or but there has to be movement in the right direction. And I think, like a lot of your work, it's again rural development, security, and economy, and so that weaves back in to the issue of the urban-rural divide in Colombia, and it would be a way of pulling a lot of these campesinos out of rural poverty. I mean, that's a rural misery. I assume at the end of it, that's hopefully what we're looking for.
Yeah, for sure. Although I have to say that I don't like speaking of people living in rural Colombia as being just in misery, because I think some of the most wonderful communities in this country are rural communities, and of course many do live in poverty, but many have also found are very organized politically and managed to utilize collective action to fill the void that the Colombia central state has never been able to fill. And so, and that's key, because I think it's important not to treat or to turn rural Colombians into a caricature of misery. They're very active agents of their lives, and they have been the protagonists in terms of curtailing the worst abuses that Colombia's central government has been inflicting on them. in particular through security and drug policy.
Mhm.
So yes, it is about that. It's about rebalancing power. It's about, today, and if you think about the illicit cocaine market, 1%, sometimes less, of the whole of the value generated in the cocaine supply chain ends up in the hands of farmers, and farmers who grow coca have been at very one of the poorest populations in Colombia. And right now, actually, there is a crisis in terms of coca prices in places like Catatumbo and Tumaco, because for a number of different reasons, there has been a glut of coca production and of cocaine inventories, which means that the organizations that purchase coca for the drug trade have not been needing to buy much coca. But of course, we have been fixated, and as you said, the Duque administration in particular was absurdly fixated on getting rid of coca bushes and on directing the state apparatus against coca farmers, even though they are the least relevant in terms of dealing with security issues related to cocaine and to the drug market. So I think in terms of changing this situation, building legal markets for coca leaf, and hopefully, ideally, in my view, under a public health scheme, also for cocaine, should be a way for us to improve the way that the economics of these markets work, and have much more resources allocated to the first step in that supply system, as well as to the last step, because people in working in micro trafficking organizations are also, for the most part, desperately poor or living very much at the edge, and changing the conditions for that part of the equation is also fundamental.
So we're also looking at altering stigma and changing that to opportunity. Yes,
in a sober way, so to speak, in the sense that it would be ridiculous for us to try to legalize these substances in a model similar to tobacco or to alcohol. Handing corporations control of substances that can harm us, and that it is not something to be done lightly or at all. The profit motive around things like drugs and guns and other things that are currently managed through for-profit organizations is not a wise way to organize society. And there are a number of ideas on both how to control the profit motive, as well as different organizational structures that we should be thinking about and implementing for these industries. And I think a lot more work needs to go into how we leverage some concepts actually that indigenous people have around the way that drugs should be used, as well as the way that we organize people around industry, so that we don't end up with a situation with people pushing substances for profit. We don't want that. That should not be part of the next step in terms of drug regulation.
Do you feel, and as we're winding this down, do you feel, David, that there is a greater understanding of the sacred nature of the plant and the hoja now, more so than maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago?
For sure. I think that both indigenous organizations as well as some campesino organizations have been waking up to the possibilities of coca, and have been doing a great job of re-educating parts of society. I think a lot more work needs to be done. But I think the changes in cannabis, the psychedelic renaissance, has also contributed to society having a bit less of a black and white understanding of what drugs or psychoactive substances are, and that actually they have always had beneficial uses. And we just need to figure out ways of making those more prevalent and helping people who will end up inevitably, whether they are prohibited or not, struggling with substance use disorders.
So it's kind of like, let's take the ancestral uses and respect for such things, but also approach them with a public health mentality.
I mean, in a nutshell, I mean, that means the specifics of that mean a lot of things, but yes.
Oh,
yes, and it's not just about controls. It's not just about telling people not to consume or to consume very little at a certain time and imposing taxes and restrictions. It's also about, I think, educating ourselves on what are the positive uses that these plants have, and encouraging the behaviors, the social norms, the environments where those beneficial uses can have a bigger share of mind in the individual and a bigger part of society. I think in the psychedelics world that is being discussed, I think there's a lot of opportunity for cannabis and for coca leaf on that front as well.
Well, plenty to think about there, and please continue with your research. And I urge my listeners out there to check out David Restrepo's writings online. Lots, as you can tell, he's fluent in English, lots in English, and incredibly accessible and very accessible, not only easy to find on the internet, but accessible to understand. So therefore to educate ourselves better in such a well, I think would say a thorny topic, especially when we think about the global implications of what happens to Colombia and of course now Peru, of course, and Bolivia and elsewhere, and the violence that surrounds said products and the stigma that comes along with them. But if we educate ourselves better, then of course anything's possible. But it's obviously down to the politicians at the end. But you say, with the indigenous authorities and the indigenous and ancestral uses being a greater understanding, then more community participation, these things there, at least the dialogue is there and open. And so let me take this moment to say, David, thank you so much for sharing just, I know, a tiny percentage of your knowledge on this subject.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure, and I hope people take an interest in this topic that has been so overlooked, but is so important.
It is so important, and those of us, who visited here, who have come down here or live here, it's central to everything in Colombia, and that's a reality. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been an item on a peace accord. That's why it wouldn't have been, a whole security doctrine under the last administration, and so on. So, any conversation between high-ranking U.S. politicians and Colombian politicians always has, let's say the I don't want to say drug war, but the drug issue is always on the table. So there needs to be a wider, more academic conversation to begin with to allow us to move forwards positively towards this. David, thank you so much for your time. Is there anywhere you would like to send my listeners, anywhere that you think they might benefit from reading or listening?
Sorry, I think
we jumped. Yes. Is there any way you could direct my listeners anywhere that you think that they might benefit from reading?
Well, go to the CESED page.
Okay.
There's loads on policy there. I think I also, in terms of coca leaf, check out Coca NASA's website and buy their products. They're wonderful. And, there are a number of things that I've written on the topic. The MAPS bulletin in English goes over, what's going on right now and the relevance of coca leaf to the discussion. this kind of renaissance of ancestral uses of psychoactive plants.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We've been talking to David Restrepo, Director of Investigations at the CESED. That's a CESED. It's Los Andes University here in Bogota. We've been talking about all sorts of things, but it's been a fascinating conversation. Of course, we'll be back next week with more information and more conversations about topics Colombia related. We'll sign off now, but not before some messages from our sponsors. Of course, you click on them, look up their websites, bnbcolombia.com and latinnews.com. They'll continue to support us and we'll continue to bring out the podcast. So thank you again, David Restrepo. Thank you for all of you out there listening. It's been a real pleasure. See you again next week.